The day the world realized America was different. For most of human history, the great powers of war came from one place, Europe. Empires rose from London, Paris, Madrid, and Rome. Their fleets ruled the oceans, their armies crushed continents, their flags spread across the map like ink spilled across the world. But in the late 1700s, something strange appeared on the other side of the Atlantic. A young country, an experiment, a nation that many European leaders believed would not survive a decade, the United States of America. At first, the world barely noticed it. It was weak, it was poor, it had almost no navy. Its army was tiny. But slowly, quietly, something was changing. Because this new nation had something different. It had ambition. And before long, the world would begin to feel the consequences. Over the next 2 centuries, the United States would become involved in wars across nearly every corner of the planet. Some were defensive, some were ideological, some were controversial, and some began with a shock so sudden that entire nations couldn't believe what had just happened. This is the story of those wars, from the deserts of North Africa, to the jungles of Vietnam, to the mountains of Afghanistan, to the battlefields of Iraq, and to the modern tensions now shaping the future of the Middle East. 23 major conflicts, 2 centuries of warfare, moments when nations were stunned, terrified, and sometimes humiliated by the sudden arrival of American power. This is the story of every major war the United States started, led, or heavily supported. And our story begins in a place far from America's shores, North Africa, the early 1800s, where a young nation decided it would no longer bow to the old rules of empire. First War, the First Barbary War, 1801 to 1805. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Mediterranean Sea was controlled by powerful North African states known as the Barbary States. Tripoli, Algiers, Tunis, Morocco. Their ships ruled the waters. Their corsairs, pirates backed by governments, captured foreign vessels and demanded tribute from European nations in exchange for safe passage. For centuries, powerful countries simply paid. It was cheaper than war, and so tribute flowed. Gold, silver, weapons, ships, even slaves. To the rulers of the Barbary states, this was normal. This was power. But in 1801, something unusual happened. A new nation appeared in the Mediterranean trade routes, the United States. At first, the Barbary rulers assumed the Americans would follow the same pattern as Europe: pay tribute, avoid conflict, accept the rules. But America had a different idea. The newly elected U.S. President, Thomas Jefferson, believed tribute payments were humiliating. To Jefferson, paying pirates for protection was not diplomacy. It was extortion, and he refused. The ruler of Tripoli, Yusuf Karamanli, was stunned. For generations, European powers had paid tribute without hesitation. Now this young country across the ocean was refusing. Karamanli's response was simple: war. In May 1801, Tripoli declared war on the United States. But what happened next shocked the Barbary states. Instead of backing down, America sent its navy. For the first time in its history, the United States deployed warships across the Atlantic to fight a foreign war. American frigates began patrolling the Mediterranean. Battles erupted at sea. Pirate ships were captured. Blockades were imposed. But the war truly shocked the Barbary states in 1805, because the Americans did something no foreign power had attempted before. They attacked Tripoli on land. A small force of U.S. Marines, led by William Eaton, marched across hundreds of miles of desert from Egypt toward the city of Derna. The journey was brutal. Scorching heat, lack of supplies, constant danger. But when the Americans reached Derna, they launched an attack that stunned Tripoli's defenders. For the first time in history, the American flag was raised over a foreign battlefield. The victory became legendary. Even today, the United States Marine Corps remembers it in their famous line, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli." The war ended shortly afterward. Tripoli agreed to peace. American prisoners were released. And the Barbary states realized something unexpected. This new country across the Atlantic was not afraid to fight. Second War. The Second Barbary War, 1815. 10 years later, the Barbary states made a mistake. They believed America had become weak again. During the War of 1812, the United States had been busy fighting Britain. The Barbary pirates saw an opportunity. American ships were once again captured. Sailors were taken hostage. Tribute demands returned. To the rulers of Algiers, it seemed obvious. America would pay again. But they had misunderstood something important. The United States had changed. The war with Britain had hardened the young nation. Its navy was stronger. Its leaders were angrier. And in 1815, the United States decided to send a message. President James Madison authorized a powerful naval expedition. A fleet of American warships sailed directly into the Mediterranean. Their target, Algiers. The Barbary rulers were stunned. Instead of negotiating, the Americans attacked. Within weeks, U.S. forces captured multiple Algerian ships and destroyed pirate fleets. The ruler of Algiers quickly realized something terrifying. This was not the timid young country they remembered. This was a nation willing to fight. And if the war continued, Algiers might lose everything. So the Barbary state did something that shocked the Mediterranean world. They surrendered. American prisoners were freed. Tribute payments ended forever. And piracy against American ships stopped. For centuries, European powers had tolerated Barbary piracy, but the United States had ended it in 2 wars. The message was clear. America was no longer a fragile experiment. It was becoming a military power. And the world was about to see just how far that power could go. Because only a few decades later, America would fight a war that changed the map of an entire continent. A war that shocked a neighboring nation. And a war that nearly doubled the size of the United States overnight. Mexico would soon learn that lesson the hard way. When a nation doubled in size. In the early 1800s, the United States was still young. Its population was growing. Its cities were expanding. And its leaders were beginning to believe something powerful. Something that would shape the next century of American history. They believed the United States was destined to expand across the continent. Many Americans called this belief manifest destiny. To supporters, it felt like fate. To others, it looked like conquest. And in the 1840s, this belief would ignite one of the most controversial wars in American history. A war that shocked an entire nation. Mexico. Third War. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. In the 1846, tensions between the United States and Mexico were already boiling. Years earlier, Texas had fought a rebellion against Mexico and declared independence. Eventually, Texas joined the United States. But Mexico refused to recognize the new border. The disagreement centered on a strip of land between 2 rivers. To Americans, the border was the Rio Grande. To Mexico, it was the Nueces River, farther north. And the difference between those 2 rivers meant thousands of square miles of disputed territory. And in 1846, the United States made a move that stunned Mexico. American troops marched into the disputed region. The decision came from U.S. President James K. Polk, a leader determined to expand American territory. Polk believed the United States should stretch all the way to the Pacific Ocean. California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah. To him, it wasn't ambition, it was destiny. When Mexican soldiers clashed with American troops in the disputed territory, Polk declared that American blood had been shed on American soil. Congress declared war. For Mexico, the news was shocking. They believed the United States had deliberately provoked the conflict, and suddenly their northern neighbor was invading. The American strategy was aggressive. Instead of one army, the United States attacked from multiple directions. One force moved into California, another advanced through New Mexico. But the most devastating campaign came from the Gulf Coast. In 1847, American forces launched an amphibious invasion near the city of Veracruz. It was one of the first large-scale amphibious assaults in modern history. Mexican defenders were stunned. American artillery pounded the city. After weeks of bombardment, Veracruz fell. But the Americans didn't stop. They marched inland. The U.S. Army, commanded by Winfield Scott, pushed toward the Mexican capital. Battle after battle followed. Cerro Gordo, Contreras, Churubusco, Molino del Rey. Each defeat pushed Mexican forces closer to the edge. But the final blow came outside Mexico City, at a hilltop fortress known as Chapultepec. The fortress guarded the capital. If it fell, the city would be defenseless. Mexican cadets, many of them teenagers, defended the castle with desperate courage. The battle was brutal. American troops stormed the hill under heavy fire. Artillery thundered, smoke covered the battlefield, and eventually the fortress fell. When American soldiers entered Mexico City in September 1847, the war was effectively over. Mexico was stunned. Its capital had been captured. Its army was broken, and the consequences would reshape North America. In 1848, the two nations signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The treaty forced Mexico to give up nearly half its territory: California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, parts of Colorado and Wyoming. To Mexico, it felt like humiliation. To the United States, it felt like triumph. And the country had nearly doubled in size, and the world was beginning to notice something unsettling. This young nation was expanding rapidly, and it was willing to use military power to do it. But America's next war would not just change borders. It would signal something even bigger: the arrival of the United States as a global empire. Fourth War, the Spanish-American War, 1898. By the late 1800s, the United States had grown into a powerful industrial nation. Factories roared, railroads stretched across the continent, cities exploded with growth, and many American leaders began to believe their country should play a larger role on the world stage. The opportunity came in the Caribbean, on the island of Cuba. At the time, Cuba was still a colony of Spain, but Cuban rebels had been fighting for independence for years. The conflict was brutal. Spanish forces used harsh tactics to crush the rebellion. Reports of suffering spread through American newspapers. Public outrage grew. Many Americans demanded intervention. Then something shocking happened. On February 15, 1898, a U.S. battleship exploded in Havana Harbor. The ship was the USS Maine. The explosion killed more than 250 American sailors. No one knew exactly what caused it, but American newspapers immediately blamed Spain. Across the United States, anger exploded. "Remember the Maine!" became a rallying cry, and soon war followed. In April 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. For Spain, the situation was terrifying. Their empire had already been shrinking. Now they were facing a rapidly growing industrial power, and the Americans attacked everywhere at once. The war stretched across the globe, in the Philippines, in the Caribbean, on the island of Cuba. One of the most famous battles took place near Santiago, Cuba. There, American troops, including a volunteer cavalry unit known as the Rough Riders, charged up a hill under heavy fire. Their leader was a young American named Theodore Roosevelt. The charge became legendary. Spanish defenses collapsed. Soon after, American naval forces destroyed the Spanish fleet near Santiago Harbor. Spain's navy was shattered, and within months the war was over. The consequences were dramatic. Spain lost control of several territories. The United States gained Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Suddenly, the United States controlled land thousands of miles from its shores. America had become something new, an overseas empire. But the people of the Philippines had expected something very different. They thought the Americans had come to help them win independence from Spain. Instead, they discovered the United States had other plans, and their reaction would ignite another war, a war far more brutal than the last. Fifth War, the Philippine-American War, 1899 to 1902. When Spain lost the Philippines in 1898, Filipino revolutionaries believed their long struggle for independence had finally succeeded. For years, they had fought Spanish colonial rule. Thousands had died, cities had been destroyed. But now Spain was gone. Surely independence would follow. But the United States saw the islands differently. American leaders believed the Philippines could become a strategic base for trade and military power in Asia. They did not want to give them up. And the tension exploded in February 1899. A gunshot, an argument. A nervous American soldier fired at Filipino troops near Manila. Within hours, fighting spread across the city. And suddenly, two former allies were at war. The Philippine forces were led by revolutionary leader Emilio Aguinaldo. His army fought fiercely, but the United States had advantages the Filipinos could not match. More troops, more weapons, more supplies. American commanders launched large offensives across the islands. Cities fell. Armies were pushed back. Eventually, Filipino forces switched tactics. Instead of conventional battles, they began fighting a guerrilla war. Ambushes, surprise attacks, jungle warfare. For American soldiers, the conflict became exhausting and brutal. Villages were searched. Rebel fighters disappeared into forests and mountains. And the war dragged on. Both sides suffered heavily. The United States eventually captured Aguinaldo in 1901. Without their leader, organized resistance collapsed. By 1902, the war was largely over. The Philippines became a U.S. territory. But the conflict left deep scars. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died during the war and the diseases that followed. For many Filipinos, the war was not liberation. It was a new form of colonial rule. For the United States, however, the war confirmed something important. America was no longer just a continental power. It was now projecting military force across oceans. The country that once fought pirates in the Mediterranean was now controlling islands in Asia. And soon the United States would be drawn into wars far larger than anyone imagined. Conflicts involving entire continents. Wars that would shape the fate of the entire world. Because the 20th century was about to begin. And with it, two world wars. Wars where the United States would arrive late but change everything. When America entered the world's biggest wars. By the early 20th century, the United States had transformed. Just decades earlier, it had been a young nation expanding across North America. Now it was something far more powerful. Factories across the country produced steel, ships, and weapons at incredible speed. American railroads stretched thousands of miles. Its population had exploded, and its economy was becoming one of the largest in the world. But despite this growth, the United States still tried to stay out of Europe's endless wars. For more than a century, American leaders believed the country should avoid entangling alliances and distant conflicts. Europe's rival empires were constantly fighting. America preferred to stay away. But in 1914, a conflict erupted that would drag nearly the entire planet into war, and eventually it would pull the United States in as well. Sixth War, World War I, 1917 to 1918. The war began in Europe in the summer of 1914. After the assassination of an Austrian archduke, alliances triggered a chain reaction across the continent. Within weeks, Europe exploded into war. On one side stood the Central Powers, led by Germany and Austria-Hungary. On the other side stood the Allied powers, including France, United Kingdom, and Russia. At first, the United States stayed neutral. President Woodrow Wilson promised Americans that the country would remain out of the conflict, and most Americans agreed. The war seemed like a distant European tragedy, but slowly events began pulling the United States closer. One of the biggest turning points came in the Atlantic Ocean. Germany had deployed powerful submarines called U-boats. Their mission was simple: destroy ships supplying Britain. German submarines began sinking vessels across the Atlantic. But in 1915, something happened that shocked the world. A German U-boat torpedoed the British passenger liner RMS Lusitania. The ship sank in minutes. Nearly 1,200 people died. Among them were more than 100 Americans. The news horrified the United States. Public anger grew. Still, the country did not immediately join the war. But Germany made another mistake. In 1917, British intelligence intercepted a secret message sent by Germany to Mexico. And the telegram proposed a shocking alliance. If Mexico joined Germany against the United States, Germany promised to help Mexico recover territory it had lost decades earlier. Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. The message became known as the Zimmermann telegram. When Americans learned about it, outrage exploded. Soon after, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. In April 1917, the United States officially entered World War I. At first, the arrival of American troops seemed small compared to Europe's massive armies, but their impact would soon become enormous. Millions of fresh American soldiers crossed the Atlantic. They arrived in France with energy, resources, and confidence. For the exhausted Allied armies, it felt like a lifeline. For Germany, it was terrifying. German generals knew time was running out. They launched massive offensives in 1918, hoping to defeat the Allies before American forces fully arrived. But the attacks failed. American troops joined Allied counterattacks that pushed German forces back. Battle after battle followed. By late 1918, Germany's army was collapsing. Facing defeat, Germany requested an armistice. The war ended on November 11, 1918. For many Europeans, the arrival of American forces had been the turning point. But few realized something else had changed. The United States had stepped onto the global stage, and it would not step off again, because only 2 decades later, the world would fall into an even more devastating conflict, a war that would engulf entire continents, a war that would force America to unleash a level of power the world had never seen before. Seventh War, World War II, 1941 to 1945. In the 1930s, another dangerous force was rising in Europe and Asia. Aggressive regimes were expanding rapidly. One of them was led by Adolf Hitler in Germany. Hitler's regime was rebuilding Germany's military and conquering neighboring countries. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan was expanding across the Pacific. By 1939, Europe was again at war. Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. The conflict quickly grew into World War II. At first, the United States again tried to remain neutral. Many Americans remembered the horrors of World War I and wanted no part in another European conflict. But in December 1941, everything changed. Without warning, Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft roared across the skies. Bombs fell on battleships. Explosions shook the harbor. In just a few hours, the United States Pacific Fleet had been devastated. More than 2,400 Americans were killed. Across the country, shock turned into fury. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress. He called December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. Soon after, the United States declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States days later. America was now fully involved in the largest war in human history. The conflict stretched across multiple continents. American forces fought in North Africa, in Europe, across the Pacific Islands, in the skies above Germany, and on the beaches of France. One of the most dramatic moments came in June 1944. Allied forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in history, as thousands of ships carried soldiers toward the coast of France. The operation was called D-Day. As the landing crafts opened, soldiers rushed onto beaches under heavy fire. Machine guns roared. Artillery thundered. The battle was chaotic and terrifying. But slowly, the Allied forces pushed inland. The invasion marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the United States fought brutal island battles against Japanese forces, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Guadalcanal. Each battle was fierce. Japanese soldiers fought with extreme determination. American casualties mounted. By 1945, the war in Europe ended with the defeat of Nazi Germany. But Japan continued fighting. American leaders feared that invading Japan's mainland could cost hundreds of thousands of lives. So the United States made a decision that stunned the world. In August 1945, American bombers dropped 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima, another on Nagasaki. The explosions were unlike anything the world had ever seen. Entire cities were destroyed. Within days, Japan surrendered. World War II was over, but the war had changed everything. The United States emerged as one of the 2 most powerful nations on Earth. The other was the Soviet Union, and their rivalry would soon divide the world into 2 opposing camps. A rivalry known as the Cold War, a conflict that would soon erupt in a small country on the Korean Peninsula. Eighth War. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953. At the end of World War II, the Korean peninsula was divided. The northern half was controlled by communist forces supported by the Soviet Union, while the southern half was backed by the United States. Two separate governments emerged, one in North Korea, the other in South Korea. Tension between them grew quickly. Then in June 1950, North Korean forces launched a massive invasion of the South. Tanks rolled across the border. Troops poured into South Korean territory. Cities fell rapidly. For South Korea, the invasion was shocking. For the United States, it was a test. American leaders feared that if communist expansion went unchecked, it could spread across Asia. So the United States responded immediately. Under a United Nations mandate, American troops were sent to defend South Korea. The war quickly became brutal. North Korean forces pushed deep into the South. At one point, South Korean and American troops were nearly pushed off the peninsula. But then American forces launched a daring counterattack. In September 1950, U.S. troops landed behind enemy lines at the port city of Incheon. The operation stunned North Korean commanders. Their supply lines collapsed. Suddenly, the momentum shifted. U.S. and South Korean forces pushed northward. They advanced almost to the border with China. But then China entered the war. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers crossed the border. The fighting intensified. Battles raged across the frozen mountains and ruined cities. The front lines shifted back and forth for years. Finally, in 1953, both sides agreed to a ceasefire. The border returned almost exactly to where it had been before the war. The Korean peninsula remained divided, and technically, the war never truly ended. Even today, North and South Korea remain separated by one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth. The Korean War was one of the first major conflicts of the Cold War, but it would not be the last, because in the coming decades, the United States would become involved in another conflict in Asia, a war that would last even longer, a war fought in dense jungles and rice paddies, a war that shocked the world. Vietnam, the Jungle Wars and Cold War shadows. After the Korean War, the world had entered a new kind of conflict. It was not a single global war like the two world wars. Instead, it was a long, tense struggle between two superpowers. On one side stood the United States and its allies. On the other stood the Soviet Union and its global partners. This rivalry became known as the Cold War. Both sides feared the spread of the other's ideology, a capitalism versus communism, democracy versus authoritarian socialism. Instead of fighting each other directly, the superpowers supported opposing sides in conflicts around the world. These wars were called proxy wars, and nowhere would this rivalry explode more violently than in Southeast Asia, a place where dense jungles, rice fields, and hidden tunnels would become the battlefield for one of the longest and most controversial wars in American history. Vietnam. War number 9, the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. In the years after World War II, Vietnam was divided. The North was controlled by communist forces led by Ho Chi Minh. The South was supported by the United States and its allies. At first, the conflict seemed small, a regional struggle for control, but American leaders feared something much bigger. They believed if Vietnam became communist, the other countries in Asia might follow. This fear was called the domino theory. If one nation fell, the rest might collapse like dominoes. So the United States began sending advisors, weapons, and support to South Vietnam. But the situation quickly spiraled. Communist fighters in the South, known as the Viet Cong, launched guerrilla attacks against South Vietnamese forces, ambushes, sabotage, night raids. They knew the jungle better than anyone, and they used it to their advantage. American involvement grew slowly at first, but in 1964, a mysterious naval confrontation changed everything. In the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin, American destroyers reported attacks by North Vietnamese patrol boats. The incident became known as the Gulf of Tonkin Incident. Soon after, the U.S. Congress authorized a major expansion of the war. American combat troops began arriving in Vietnam. At first, many believed the war would be short. The United States had overwhelming military power, modern aircraft, heavy artillery, helicopters, advanced technology. But Vietnam was not a traditional battlefield. Dense jungles hid enemy fighters. Underground tunnels stretched for miles. Guerrilla warfare made it difficult to identify the enemy. Battles erupted across villages, forests, and mountains. The war intensified dramatically. Hundreds of thousands of American troops were deployed. Bombing campaigns pounded North Vietnam. Yet the communist forces continued fighting. One of the most shocking moments came in 1968. Communist forces launched a massive surprise attack across South Vietnam. The offensive struck dozens of cities at once. Even the U.S. Our embassy compound in Saigon was attacked. The campaign became known as the Tet Offensive. Although the offensive was eventually repelled, it shocked the American public. Many people had believed the war was nearly won. Instead, it seemed endless. Protests erupted across the United States. Public support for the war began collapsing. After years of fighting, the United States began withdrawing troops. In 1973, American forces officially left Vietnam. 2 years later, communist forces captured the South Vietnamese capital. Saigon fell. The war was over. Vietnam had become a single communist country. For the United States, the war was deeply traumatic. More than 58,000 American soldiers had died. Millions of Vietnamese civilians were killed. The conflict had divided American society, and it left many leaders cautious about future wars. But even as the Vietnam War was unfolding, another dramatic attempt to shape world events had already taken place. A secret operation, an invasion that would fail spectacularly, and a moment that stunned the world. War number 10, the Bay of Pigs invasion, 1961. In 1959, a revolution had shaken the Caribbean island of Cuba. A young revolutionary named Fidel Castro had overthrown the Cuban government. Soon after, Castro aligned himself with the Soviet Union. For the United States, this was alarming. Cuba sat only about 90 miles from the American coast. Now a communist government was in power there. American leaders feared Cuba could become a base for Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere. So the U.S. government secretly began planning Castro's removal. The plan was ambitious. The CIA would train Cuban exiles, people who had fled Castro's regime. These fighters would return to Cuba and launch an invasion. Once the invasion began, American leaders hoped the Cuban population would rise up against Castro. The operation seemed bold, but it relied on many assumptions, and many of those assumptions were wrong. In April 1961, the invasion began. About 1,400 Cuban exiles landed on a remote beach known as the Bay of Pigs. The moment they landed, everything began to fall apart. The expected uprising never happened. Cuban forces quickly responded. Castro's military surrounded the invaders. Without direct American military support, the exile fighters were overwhelmed. Within days, the invasion collapsed. More than 1,000 fighters were captured. For the United States, the failure was humiliating. For Castro, it was a massive victory. The event pushed Cuba even closer to the Soviet Union. And only a year later, the world would come dangerously close to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the Cold War's most dramatic battlefield would soon shift again. This time, to the mountains of Central Asia, a place where another superpower would become trapped in a brutal war, and where the United States would secretly help its enemies. War number 11, the Soviet-Afghan War, U.S. support, 1979 to 1989. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Soviet leaders feared the collapse of a friendly communist government there, so they sent tens of thousands of troops into the country. The invasion shocked the world. Afghanistan's rugged mountains quickly became the stage for a brutal war. Local fighters, known as the Mujahideen, began resisting the Soviet army. They were poorly equipped, but they were determined, and they knew the terrain. For the United States, the Soviet invasion created an opportunity. American leaders saw the conflict as a chance to weaken their Cold War rival. So the United States began secretly supporting the Mujahideen. Weapons were delivered. Training was provided. Money flowed into the resistance movement. One of the most significant moments came when the U.S. supplied advanced anti-aircraft missiles. These weapons allowed Afghan fighters to shoot down Soviet helicopters. The Soviet army suddenly faced a new threat. Helicopters that once dominated the battlefield were now vulnerable. The war dragged on for nearly a decade. Soviet forces suffered heavy casualties. Their economy struggled under the cost of the conflict. Eventually, the Soviet Union decided to withdraw. In 1989, Soviet troops left Afghanistan. For many observers, the war had been a disaster for the Soviet Union. Some even compared it to America's experience in Vietnam. The conflict weakened Soviet power, and only a few years later, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. The Cold War was ending, but American military involvement around the world was far from over. Because in the decades that followed, the United States would launch new invasions, shorter wars, fast strikes, operations designed to remove governments or stabilize regions. And the first of these sudden invasions would take place on a tiny island in the Caribbean, an island called Grenada, the era of rapid invasions. By the early 1980s, the Cold War was nearing its final phase. The long global rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union had shaped decades of international conflict. But something new was beginning to appear. Instead of massive wars lasting years, the United States began launching short, rapid military interventions, quick strikes, limited invasions, operations designed to remove hostile governments or stabilize regions that Washington considered strategically important. To many observers, it felt like a new style of warfare, fast, decisive, and often unexpected. The first of these sudden interventions would happen on a small Caribbean island that most people around the world had barely heard of. Grenada, War Number 12, the Invasion of Grenada, 1983. In October 1983, political chaos erupted inside the Caribbean nation of Grenada. Grenada had recently undergone a revolution led by a Marxist government, but internal struggles within the ruling leadership suddenly turned violent. The country's prime minister was executed by his own political allies during a power struggle. For many governments in the region, the situation looked dangerous. The island was unstable, and its leadership had strong ties to communist powers. At the time, the Cold War was still shaping global politics. American leaders feared that Grenada might become another communist outpost in the Caribbean. There was also another concern. Hundreds of American medical students were studying on the island. U.S. officials worried that the chaos could put them in danger, so Washington made a dramatic decision. On October 25, 1983, the United States launched a military invasion of Grenada. The operation was called United States Invasion of Grenada. Thousands of American troops descended on the island. Paratroopers dropped from the sky. Warships surrounded the coastline. Helicopters swept across the island. For Grenada's military forces, the invasion was shocking. The island's army was small. Its defenses were limited. Within days, American forces secured key locations across the country. The government collapsed. The American medical students were evacuated, and a new government was eventually installed. For the United States, the operation was considered a quick military success. For critics around the world, however, the invasion raised serious questions about American power and intervention. But Grenada was only the beginning, because only a few years later, the United States would launch another invasion, on this time in Central America. And the target would be a man who had once been an ally of Washington, a powerful military leader in Panama. War Number 13. The Invasion of Panama, 1989. For years, Panama had been ruled by a powerful military leader named Manuel Noriega. Noriega had once worked closely with American intelligence agencies, but by the late 1980s, relations had deteriorated badly. The United States accused Noriega of corruption, election fraud, and involvement in international drug trafficking. Tensions escalated rapidly. Protests erupted inside Panama. Diplomatic relations collapsed, and American leaders decided the situation had gone too far. In December 1989, the United States launched a massive military operation to remove Noriega from power. The invasion was called United States Invasion of Panama. More than 20,000 American troops entered the country. Airstrikes targeted military installations. Paratroopers dropped into strategic areas. The fighting was intense in parts of Panama City. Panamanian forces attempted to resist, but the American military had overwhelming firepower. Within days, the Panamanian defense forces were defeated. Noriega fled into hiding. Eventually, he sought refuge in the Vatican embassy. But American troops surrounded the building. Loud music blasted from speakers outside the compound day and night. After several days, Noriega surrendered. He was flown to the United States to face trial. The invasion shocked many countries around the world. For the United States, it was another example of rapid military action achieving political goals. But the next war involving the United States would be much larger. It would involve dozens of nations, massive armies, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and one of the most dramatic armored battles in modern history. Because in 1990, a dictator in the Middle East made a decision that would trigger a global military response. War number 14, the Gulf War, 1990 to 1991. In August 1990, the army of Iraq crossed the border into Kuwait. Iraqi forces moved quickly. Within hours, Kuwait's defenses collapsed. The small, oil-rich nation was completely occupied. The invasion stunned the international community. The Iraqi leader responsible was Saddam Hussein. Hussein believed Kuwait was historically part of Iraq. He also wanted control of Kuwait's vast oil reserves. But the invasion created a dangerous new reality. If Iraq kept Kuwait, it would control an enormous share of the world's oil supply. For many countries, this was unacceptable. The United Nations condemned the invasion, and the United States began building a massive international coalition. Countries from around the world joined the effort. More than 30 nations eventually participated. The military campaign was called Gulf War. First came an enormous air campaign. For weeks, coalition aircraft bombed Iraqi military targets, air defenses, command centers, missile sites, supply lines. The bombing was relentless. Then in February 1991, the ground war began. Coalition forces launched a massive armored assault into Kuwait and southern Iraq. Tanks rolled across the desert. Helicopters attacked Iraqi positions. The Iraqi army struggled to resist. Within just 100 hours of ground combat, Iraqi forces were defeated. Kuwait was liberated. The coalition had achieved its objective. But Saddam Hussein remained in power, and the tensions between Iraq and the United States were far from over. Because only a decade later, those tensions would erupt into another war, one far more controversial. But before that happened, American troops would become involved in another dangerous mission, a mission in East Africa that began as humanitarian aid and ended in one of the most intense urban battles American soldiers had faced since Vietnam. War number 15, the Somalia Intervention, 1992 to 1995. In the early 1990s, the East African nation of Somalia collapsed into chaos. The central government had fallen. Rival warlords fought for control of cities and regions. The conflict triggered a massive humanitarian disaster. Food supplies collapsed. Famine spread. Millions of civilians faced starvation. And the international community responded with a humanitarian mission. The United Nations requested military assistance to protect food shipments and stabilize the country. The United States agreed to lead the operation. American troops arrived in Somalia in 1992. At first, the mission focused on delivering aid. Food convoys moved through devastated regions. International forces attempted to secure major cities. But the situation quickly became complicated. Powerful warlords resisted foreign intervention. One of them was Mohammed Farah Aidid. His militia fought fiercely against international forces. Tensions escalated. Then in October 1993, a mission to capture Aidid's commanders turned into a nightmare. American helicopters were shot down in the city of Mogadishu. Soldiers were trapped in the streets. Militia fighters surrounded them. What followed was an intense urban battle that lasted through the night. The event became known as the Battle of Mogadishu. American troops fought desperately to rescue their comrades. The battle was brutal. 18 American soldiers were killed. Hundreds of Somali fighters and civilians died. Images from the battle shocked the world. Soon after, the United States decided to withdraw its forces from Somalia. The intervention had begun as a humanitarian mission, but it had turned into a violent conflict. For many American leaders, the Somalia experience reinforced a difficult lesson. Military interventions in unstable regions could quickly spiral into unpredictable wars. Yet despite these warnings, the United States would soon find itself involved in even larger conflicts. Because by the end of the 1990s, the collapse of Yugoslavia would ignite another war in Europe. And once again, American military power would play a decisive role. The late 1990s conflicts and the War on Terror. By the end of the 20th century, the global balance of power had changed dramatically. The Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991. For the first time in decades, the United States stood alone as the world's most powerful military force. Many analysts began calling the new era the unipolar moment, a period where one nation held overwhelming global influence. But instead of bringing peace, the end of the Cold War introduced new kinds of conflicts: ethnic wars, civil wars, regional instability, and new threats from extremist groups. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, the United States would once again deploy its military power across the world, sometimes through NATO alliances, sometimes through direct invasion, and sometimes through long wars that would last decades. War 16, the Kosovo War, 1998 to 1999. In the late 1990s, the Balkan region of Europe was already scarred by years of violence. The collapse of Yugoslavia had triggered multiple conflicts across the region. One of the most dangerous emerged in the province of Kosovo. Kosovo was home to a large ethnic Albanian population living inside Serbia. Tensions between Serbian authorities and ethnic Albanian separatists escalated rapidly. Violence spread across villages. Thousands of civilians fled their homes. Reports of massacres and ethnic cleansing shocked the international community. The Western governments feared the crisis could destabilize the entire region. So NATO, led primarily by the United States, decided to intervene. In March 1999, NATO launched a massive air campaign against Serbia. The operation became known as the Kosovo War. For 78 days, NATO aircraft bombed military targets across Serbia: air defenses, bridges, command centers, military bases. Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic refused to back down at first, but the relentless air campaign gradually weakened Serbian forces. Eventually, Serbia agreed to withdraw its troops from Kosovo. International peacekeeping forces entered the region. For many Western governments, the intervention was seen as a humanitarian mission. For others, especially in Serbia and Russia, it was viewed as a controversial use of military power without direct United Nations authorization. But the world was about to face an even more dramatic conflict, a war that would begin with one of the most shocking attacks in modern history, an attack that would reshape global politics for decades. War 17, the war in Afghanistan, 2001 to 2021. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the world changed. 19 terrorists from the extremist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial airplanes inside the United States. 2 of them were flown directly into the towers of the World Trade Center. Another crashed into the Pentagon. The 4th plane crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers attempted to stop the hijackers. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in American history. When investigators quickly traced the attacks to Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden was hiding in Afghanistan, protected by the Taliban government. The Taliban refused to hand him over. The United States responded with war. In October 2001, American and Allied forces launched the war in Afghanistan. Airstrikes pounded Taliban positions. Special forces worked alongside Afghan fighters opposing the Taliban. Within weeks, the Taliban government collapsed. But the war did not end. Taliban fighters retreated into rural areas and across the border into Pakistan. They reorganized. They launched insurgent attacks, roadside bombs, ambushes, guerrilla warfare. What began as a quick military victory slowly turned into America's longest war. For 20 years, the United States and its allies attempted to stabilize Afghanistan. New governments were formed, elections were held, but the Taliban insurgency never fully disappeared. Finally, in 2021, the United States withdrew its remaining troops. Within weeks, the Taliban rapidly regained control of the country. For many observers, the war raised difficult questions about the limits of military power in complex political conflicts. But while the war in Afghanistan was unfolding, American leaders made another decision, a decision that would trigger one of the most controversial wars of the 21st century, the invasion of Iraq. War 18. The Iraq War, 2003 to 2011. In 2003, the United States accused the government of Iraq of possessing weapons of mass destruction. American officials argued that Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein posed a serious threat to international security. They also claimed Iraq might support terrorist groups. However, many countries questioned the evidence. Debate inside the United Nations became intense. Some governments opposed military action, others supported it. Despite the controversy, the United States assembled a coalition of allied nations. In March 2003, the invasion began. The operation quickly overwhelmed Iraqi forces. American troops advanced rapidly toward Baghdad. Within weeks, the Iraqi government collapsed. Saddam Hussein's regime fell. But what followed was far more complicated. The country descended into chaos. Various militant groups began fighting coalition forces. Sectarian violence erupted between different communities. Roadside bombs and urban combat became common. American troops remained in Iraq for years, attempting to stabilize the country. In 2011, most U.S. forces withdrew, but the region remained unstable. And out of that instability, a new extremist organization would soon emerge, a group that would shock the world with its brutality. War 19, the Libya Intervention, 2011. In 2011, protests erupted across many countries in the Middle East during a wave of uprisings known as the Arab Spring. One of those uprisings occurred in Libya. Demonstrations against Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi quickly turned into armed conflict. Rebel groups attempted to overthrow the government. Gaddafi's forces responded with heavy military attacks. Fearing a humanitarian disaster, the United Nations authorized international military intervention. NATO launched an air campaign to protect civilians and support rebel forces. The operation became known as the 2011 military intervention in Libya. American and Allied aircraft targeted Libyan military installations, air defenses, command centers, armored units. Eventually, rebel forces captured the capital. Gaddafi's government collapsed. The longtime leader was killed later that year. But the aftermath was chaotic. Libya fragmented into rival factions. Militias fought for control of cities and oil facilities. For many analysts, the conflict demonstrated how removing a government did not always guarantee stability, and the next threat emerging from the Middle East would prove even more dangerous. War 20. The war against ISIS, 2014 to present. By 2014, a new extremist group had emerged from the chaos in Iraq and Syria. The group called itself the Islamic State. ISIS rapidly captured large areas of territory in both countries. Entire cities fell under its control. The group declared the creation of a so-called caliphate. Its fighters carried out brutal attacks and executions that shocked the world. The international response was swift. The United States organized a coalition of dozens of countries. Airstrikes targeted ISIS positions across Syria and Iraq. Local ground forces, supported by coalition air power, gradually pushed ISIS back. Major cities such as Mosul and Raqqa were eventually liberated. By 2019, ISIS had lost most of its territorial control. However, smaller insurgent cells continue to operate in parts of the region. The fight against extremist groups remains ongoing. By the early 2020s, the United States had been involved in conflicts across multiple continents, from the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan. But new geopolitical tensions were emerging. A major war in Eastern Europe, rising proxy conflicts in the Middle East, and growing confrontation between powerful nations. The next chapter of this story moves into the present day, where modern wars are fought not only with armies, but with alliances, economic pressure, and advanced technology, and where the role of the United States continues to shape conflicts across the world. The modern proxy wars and rising global tensions. By the 2020s, warfare had entered a new era. Traditional invasions like those seen in World War II or the Gulf War were becoming less common. Instead, conflicts were increasingly fought through alliances, proxy forces, intelligence support, and advanced technology. Drones, cyber warfare, precision missiles, satellite intelligence. The United States remained the most powerful military force in the world, but its role in modern conflicts often took a different form. Rather than large-scale invasions, the U.S. frequently supported partners, provided weapons, and coordinated multinational coalitions. These modern conflicts are more complex. Sometimes the United States is directly involved. Other times it plays a supporting role. But in nearly every major global conflict today, American influence can still be felt. And the first of these modern proxy wars began during the chaos of the Arab Spring. War number 21, the Syrian Civil War, U.S. involvement, 2011 to present. In 2011, protests erupted across Syria. The demonstrations were part of the wider Arab Spring. Protesters demanded political reform and the resignation of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. But the protests quickly turned violent. Government forces cracked down on demonstrations. Opposition groups formed armed militias. The country descended into a brutal civil war. Multiple factions entered the conflict: Syrian government forces, rebel groups, extremist organizations, regional powers, global superpowers. Soon, Syria became one of the most complicated battlefields in modern history. The United States initially supported certain rebel groups fighting against Assad's government. American forces also conducted military operations against extremist groups such as ISIS operating within Syria. Airstrikes targeted militant strongholds. Special forces assisted local fighters. The conflict soon drew in other major powers as well. Russia intervened to support the Syrian government. Meanwhile, the regional actors like Turkey and Iran became heavily involved. The result was a devastating war that displaced millions of civilians. Entire cities were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands were killed. Even today, the Syrian conflict remains unresolved. But while Syria was collapsing into war, another humanitarian disaster was unfolding nearby. This time in Yemen. War number 22. The Yemen War, U.S. support, 2014 to present. The country of Yemen has long struggled with political instability, but in 2014, tensions erupted into full-scale war. A rebel group known as the Houthis seized control of the capital city. The internationally recognized Yemeni government fled. Soon after, a coalition led by Saudi Arabia launched a military intervention to restore the government. The United States did not deploy large numbers of combat troops, but it played a significant supporting role. American intelligence, weapons sales, logistical support. The conflict quickly turned into one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Airstrikes destroyed infrastructure. Food shortages spread across the country. Millions of civilians faced famine. The war also became part of a larger regional struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran, both supporting different sides. Even today, the conflict in Yemen remains unstable, with fragile ceasefires and occasional fighting continuing. But another conflict, thousands of miles away in Eastern Europe, would soon dominate global headlines. War number 23, the Russia-Ukraine War, U.S. support, 2014 to present. Tensions between Russia and Ukraine had been building for years. In 2014, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine. Fighting soon erupted in eastern Ukraine between Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed separatists. But the conflict escalated dramatically in 2022. Russian forces launched a large-scale invasion of Ukraine. Missiles struck major cities. Armored columns advanced toward the capital. The attack shocked the world. The United States quickly became Ukraine's largest supporter. Although American troops were not deployed directly into combat, the United States provided massive assistance. Advanced weapon systems, air defense systems, financial aid, military intelligence. Western allies joined the effort. The war quickly became one of the largest conflicts in Europe since World War II. Ukrainian forces resisted fiercely. Cities such as Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Mariupol became major battle zones. The war continues today with no clear end in sight. For many analysts, the conflict represents a new era of geopolitical rivalry between major powers. And while the world watched the war in Ukraine unfold, another dangerous confrontation was rising in the Middle East, one involving three powerful players: the United States, Israel, and Iran. War number 24. Rising U.S.-Israel-Iran confrontation. In recent years, tensions between Israel and Iran have escalated dramatically. Iran has supported armed groups across the region, groups such as Hezbollah and other militias allied with Tehran. Israel has repeatedly carried out strikes against Iranian-linked targets in Syria and elsewhere. The United States has also been involved through military deployments, sanctions, and regional alliances. American forces maintain bases across the Middle East. Aircraft carriers patrol nearby waters. Non-missile defense systems protect allied countries. Occasionally, direct clashes occur: missile strikes, drone attacks, naval confrontations. While a full-scale war between the United States and Iran has not yet erupted, tensions remain extremely high. Any major escalation could trigger a wider regional conflict involving multiple countries. For now, the situation remains a dangerous standoff, but history has shown how quickly tensions can spiral into war. 2 centuries of American wars. From the shores of Tripoli in 1801 to the mountains of Afghanistan, to the battlefields of Iraq and Syria, the United States has been involved in dozens of conflicts over the past 2 centuries. Some wars were fought to defend allies. Others were fought to remove hostile governments. Some were humanitarian interventions, when others were controversial invasions that divided global opinion. But one thing is undeniable: American military power has shaped the modern world. Entire borders have changed because of these wars. Governments have risen and fallen, and millions of lives have been affected by decisions made in Washington. Today, the world remains just as complicated. New alliances are forming, old rivalries are returning, and the next chapter of global conflict is still being written. Because history has shown something again and again: war rarely ends forever. It only pauses until the next crisis begins.